Deep in the shadowy woodlands of upstate New York, beneath the creaking floorboards of an abandoned church, 143 unmarked graves were uncovered in 1862. Each skeleton bore chilling signs of systematic torment: bones fractured and healed before death, lungs scarred from repeated near drownings, and arcane carvings etched into their very bones. Local officials dutifully recorded these horrors, but the federal government locked away all records tied to the Church of the Pure Spirit, classified and hidden for over 160 years. But now, for the first time, I have obtained confidential documents that reveal a nightmare hidden from history. These documents expose the grim saga of three brothers, Elder Ezra Deacon Silas and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, who lured hundreds of followers into a doctrine where agony was divine. Their twisted rites of spiritual purification birthed one of the most disturbing cults in American religious history. The village of Ravenwood, nestled in the quiet hills of upstate New York, was once an unassuming farming settlement of just 300 souls. Founded in 1803 by Hudson Valley migrants chasing prosperity, it thrived modestly on agriculture, timber, and barter. But Ravenwood, like much of western New York, became a hotspot during the Second Great Awakening, a seismic religious revival that gripped early 19th century America. It earned the nickname the Burned-Over District for the wildfire-like spread of impassioned religious movements. New creeds sparked and old faiths were scorched. Charismatic preachers could summon thousands into outdoor revival meetings with trembling voices and promises of divine revelation. It was into this spiritual inferno that the Ravencroft brothers descended in the summer of 1825. Elder Ezra, aged 42, exuded authority. His deep-set coal-black eyes seemed to look straight through people when he preached of divine reckoning. Deacon Silas, 39, had the air of a brooding scholar, his spectacles perched atop a nose forever smudged with ink hands, ink-stained from scribing endless religious manuscripts. Then came Prophet Caleb, the youngest, at 35, pale, hypnotic, and terrifying. He whispered sermons that echoed across packed rooms, and his ice-blue eyes often rolled back as he entered what he called ecstatic communion with the Spirit. With considerable funds, the brothers purchased a vast tract on Ravenwood's outskirts. There they began erecting their sanctum, the Church of the Pure Spirit. It bore no resemblance to the quaint white meeting houses typical of New England. Instead, it was crafted from brooding dark stone, quarried nearby, designed with eerie precision, an octagonal core sanctuary encircled by 8 smaller chambers, all dominated by a looming spire that pierced the forest skyline. Notably, the sanctuary lacked windows. Instead, services were bathed in lantern-light shadows, dancing like spirits on the walls. At the inaugural gathering, well attended out of curiosity, Elder Ezra's voice cut through the skeptical hush. We were summoned by the Spirit to this sacred land. In a world of false prophets and watered-down truth, we offer the one true path, purification through tribulation. This land shall bear witness to the birth of a higher truth. The timing of their message was flawless. In 1825, American Protestantism was splintered. Stalwart faiths, like the Episcopalians and Presbyterians, were losing their grip. Methodists were storming through frontier towns with circuit-riding preachers and fiery salvation. Baptists were booming, emphasizing raw personal conversion. And new, uniquely American faiths like the Mormons were on the rise. Into this fractured, fervent landscape, strode the Ravencrofts not just as preachers, but as prophets of pain. Just 1 year later, and fewer than 100 miles away, Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon in 1830. In this era of spiritual upheaval and yearning, the Ravencroft brothers' message took root in fertile soil. Their doctrine was at first glance disarmingly simple. Salvation could only be achieved through suffering that burned away the rot of sin and impurity like fire purges metal. They quoted scripture that spoke of refinement through flame of Christ's agony on the cross. But unlike other preachers, they took these passages literally. To the Ravencrofts, pain was no metaphor. It was the crucible of the soul. The flesh is the vessel of sin. Deacon Silas would calmly declare during sermons, his voice steady and clinical. Therefore the flesh must be tested, tried and purified through tribulation. Only when the body is broken can the spirit soar. And so the congregation grew quietly, methodically throughout that first year. The brothers were selective, even secretive about new initiates. Prospective members were required to sit for a discernment with Prophet Caleb himself, who claimed divine insight to determine their worthiness as vessels of the Spirit. Those accepted fell into 3 familiar categories: the desperately poor, yearning for belonging and purpose; the haunted and guilt-ridden, seeking absolution for past sins; and the wealthy, bored by conventional churches in search of a higher, darker spiritual thrill. Margaret Wilkins was among the earliest converts. A widow who had buried her husband and 2 children the winter before from scarlet fever. She had nearly ended her life when she crossed paths with Elder Ezra in the town square. He looked at me as though he could read my soul, she later wrote in a journal uncovered by federal agents. He said my suffering was not meaningless, but a divine preparation. For the first time since losing my family, I felt something other than emptiness. By 1827, the Church of the Pure Spirit had swelled to nearly 100 followers. Some built modest cabins encircling the main church compound, while others remained in Ravenwood, but spent nearly all their waking hours under the Ravencrofts' tutelage. Members were encouraged to surrender worldly possessions, homes, heirlooms, savings. Earthly attachments, the brothers preached, were chains that bound the soul to corruption. Those deemed most devout were elevated to the status of vessels of the Spirit, a role requiring them to undergo more intense purification rituals. These early ceremonies were severe, but still within the realm of religious asceticism. Prolonged fasting, all-night prayer vigils, ritual immersions in icy water to drown the sinful self. But behind closed doors, the brothers were slowly turning up the heat. Like frogs in a pot brought to a slow boil, the faithful were being conditioned, prepared for far more brutal forms of sacrifice. The escalation was carefully calculated. By 1829, construction began on a sprawling warren of chambers and tunnels beneath the church. It was then that the Ravencrofts cemented absolute control, not just over the actions of their followers, but over their very thoughts, their bodies, and their sense of reality. The darkness had begun. In a private meeting, later referenced in confiscated documents, Prophet Caleb was recorded, saying, "The sheep are gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd." The people of Ravenwood were about to learn that to the Ravencroft brothers, shepherding meant not guidance but sacrifice. The moment when the Church of the Pure Spirit crossed the threshold from fringe sect to something far more sinister can be traced to a single date, December 21st, 1829, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. What occurred that night later, coded in hidden church ledgers as the first ascension, set the precedent for the horrors that would follow. It began with an announcement. Elder Ezra stood before the congregation and declared that Prophet Caleb had received a divine vision, one unlike any before. Every member, regardless of age or standing, was summoned to the lantern-lit sanctuary for a ceremony that would change everything. It was described as a revelation, a new and higher level of purification. As night fell and temperatures dropped below, freezing, nearly 150 devoted followers gathered in the church's darkened sanctuary. The windowless chamber was lit only by 12 large candles, each placed precisely at the points of an enormous spiral carved into the wooden floor. The spiral wound inward, drawing the eye and the soul toward a central platform like a ritual map of the descent into mystery. Among those present was Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith, who had joined the congregation 6 months earlier after losing his wife. Years later, Hartford would escape and offer a harrowing testimony of what he witnessed that night. Elder Ezra's voice rang out with uncharacteristic fervor, rising in both volume and urgency. Brothers and sisters, he proclaimed, we have been patient shepherds, guiding you gently to understanding, but the Spirit grows impatient with our progress. The congregation held its breath. Ezra's eyes burned with intensity. Tonight, Prophet Caleb has been shown the true path to salvation, and it demands greater courage than we have ever asked of you. At that moment, Prophet Caleb entered from a side chamber. Witnesses described him as transformed, his skin unnaturally pale, his limbs twitching with unnatural rigidity. His eyes had rolled back, leaving only the whites visible. Then he began to speak, not in words, but in what he called the tongue of angels, a haunting, chaotic blend of guttural growls and high-pitched wails that ricocheted around the stone walls like a possessed hymn. After several minutes of this disturbing performance, Caleb collapsed. When he rose again, his voice returned to normal, but something in his tone had changed. There was a chilling calm, a cadence of absolute authority. The Spirit has chosen 3 among you, he announced, for the honor of the first ascension. He called their names slowly, like sacred verses: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters. The Spirit has found you worthy of elevation. The 3, each relatively new to the congregation, were gently guided to the central platform by Deacon Silas. What followed, Hartford later testified, was a ritual more barbaric than anything I thought possible among civilized people. The chosen were stripped to their undergarments despite the biting cold. Then, in silence, they were bound to large wooden frames shaped like inverted crosses. Elder Ezra addressed the hushed crowd, explaining that inversion of the sacred symbol was not blasphemy, but necessary a reversal of pride to humility, comfort to pain life to death, and then rebirth. And so began the 7 trials of purification. The trial of air came first, wet cloths laid over their faces as water was slowly poured, simulating the terror of drowning. Then the trial of earth soil from the church grounds was packed tightly around their bodies, burying them up to the necks, entombing them alive for short intervals. The trial of fire followed, in which heated metal rods were pressed against their skin, branding them with arcane symbols that matched those found later on the bones beneath the church. Next, the trial of water. The chosen were submerged in icy basins again and again until they lost consciousness, only to be revived and plunged once more. Hartford's recollection grew scattered as he described the final 3 trials. He confessed to vomiting and nearly losing consciousness himself during the ordeal. His words became disjointed, but one thing was clear. The final stages were worse. Throughout these tortures, the congregation was encouraged to chant in unison. Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation. Whenever a victim screamed, the chant grew louder. What shocked Hartford most, however, was the congregation's reaction. While some wept quietly or averted their eyes, many others were rapt eyes glazed in trance faces, bathed in candlelight and ecstasy. The Ravencrofts had over years conditioned them to see agony not as cruelty but as divine grace. Now that programming bore its awful fruit. By dawn, the 7 trials were complete. The 3 hung limp from their frames, broken, bloodied, barely breathing. But alive, they had survived the first ascension. Elder Ezra stepped forward, his eyes gleaming in the flickering candlelight. In a voice that resonated through the still stunned congregation, he proclaimed that the 3 had been emptied of sin and now stood ready to be filled with the pure spirit. What happened next would scar those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Prophet Caleb approached each victim one by one. Placing his trembling hands upon their heads, he leaned in close and whispered incomprehensible words into their ears. Words he claimed were given to him by the Spirit itself. What followed was a scene of raw terror. According to both Thomas Hartford and one other witness, an unnamed member who later spoke to authorities, the 3 began convulsing violently. Their bodies writhed against the restraint's bones, audibly snapping beneath the strain. Eyes bulged open, veins bursting red across their sclera, and then, chillingly, they began to speak. Not in English, but in the same twisted, otherworldly tongue Caleb had uttered before collapsing, high-pitched, rasping, unnatural. By the time the sun rose, all 3 were dead. Elder Ezra, unfazed, declared them successfully ascended. Their souls, he claimed, had been purified so completely, they had bypassed judgment entirely and entered heaven directly. Their bodies, now emptied of sin, were sacred vessels, holy relics to be venerated, not discarded. Rather than being buried, the corpses were carefully arranged on stone slabs in one of the newly completed chambers beneath the church. There, members could visit, pray, and meditate upon the possibility of achieving similar elevation. According to internal church records later seized during federal raids, these 3 were only the beginning, soon to be joined by hundreds more. The morning after the first ascension, the gravity of what had occurred began to settle in. Several members, shaken to their core, silently gathered what little they owned and fled Ravenwood under the cover of dawn. Among them was Thomas Hartford, though he would not speak of what he had witnessed for years, fearing ridicule, disbelief, or worse. But those who remained, they were more devoted than ever. Rather than shattering the cult's control, the ceremony solidified it. The Ravencroft brothers had crossed the line from symbolic suffering to sacramental death, and discovered to their grim satisfaction that their followers would not recoil. They leaned in. They believed harder. Death had become holy. In a private conversation recounted years later by a former elder who turned state's evidence, Prophet Caleb was reported to have told his brothers, "Now we have shown them the true face of God, and they did not turn away. There is nothing they will not accept from us now." And he was right. The first ascension was not the climax. It was the genesis. Over the next 30 years, what unfolded behind the stone walls of the Church of the Pure Spirit would become one of the most appalling chapters in the hidden history of American religion. From 1830 to 1845, the Ravencrofts carefully honed both their doctrine and their method. Publicly, they appeared pious and charitable. The church became known in religious circles as the sanctuary of spiritual renewal. They hosted revivals, welcomed traveling preachers, donated to orphanages, and aligned themselves with causes like temperance, all while polishing their image for the broader community. But beneath that polished exterior, the true machinery of horror expanded. The underground catacombs, initially no more than simple cellars, evolved into a sprawling labyrinth of secret chambers. As local construction crews were dismissed, only church members were allowed to continue the work. Eventually, only the vessels of the Spirit, the most indoctrinated, the most fanatical, were permitted to dig, to carve, to labor in silence beneath the soil. They were not just building tunnels. They were building a theology of stone and darkness. By 1835, the network had grown into something vast and terrible. Known among the inner circle as the catacombs, it featured at least 7 major chambers and dozens of narrow alcoves, each with a purpose in the Ravencrofts' twisted cosmology. There was the chamber of preparation. Candidates selected for elevation were held in complete isolation for several days before their ordeal began. They were confined to the chamber of preparation, where silence reigned and contact with others was strictly forbidden. There they were left to fast pray and meditate under flickering lanterns and the distant sound of chanting. After this period of spiritual stillness, they were led to the chamber of trials, where the 7 purifications were administered. Finally, they entered the chamber of ascension, the site of the terminal rituals. But perhaps most unsettling of all was what lay beyond these, the chamber of saints, where the dead were never truly laid to rest. Unlike most faiths that honor their dead through burial or cremation, the Ravencroft brothers refused to relinquish the bodies of their ascended. Instead, the corpses were preserved in varying states, some partially mummified using crude embalming methods, others reduced to meticulously cleaned skeletons, preserved with a precision that baffled even modern forensic experts. These bodies were not hidden. They were displayed. Some were posed in mock prayer, others with arms raised in frozen ecstasy, their hollow eye sockets aimed heavenward. Many were strung together with thin wires to maintain reverent posture, like grotesque marionettes performing eternal devotion. This morbid theater was not a secret. It was a doctrine. Elizabeth Carver, who joined the church in 1832 and managed to escape in 1844, gave one of the most harrowing accounts to federal investigators. The smell struck first, she recalled. Not rot as you'd expect. It was chemical turpentine alcohol and something cloyingly sweet. The brothers called it the perfume of sanctity, but I later learned it was embalming fluid. Carver explained how newcomers weren't immediately shown the full horror. At first, they were told of the chambers as metaphor. Later, they were granted access to the more sacred sections rooms lined with candles and scriptural murals. Only the most loyal, the ones fully broken and remade in the church's image, were brought into the chamber of saints. It was a seduction, Carver confessed, layer by layer, step by step. By the time I saw the corpses, dozens of them arranged like a congregation, I was so indoctrinated that I wept. I thought it was holy. I believed I was witnessing heaven's glory. Now those tears make me want to tear my own eyes out. The frequency of these elevations crept upward year by year. Church records, later seized by authorities, show that in 1830 there were only 2 ascensions, resulting in 5 deaths. By 1835, they were quarterly. By 1840, monthly ceremonies had become the norm, with special mass elevations held on solstices and equinoxes, often claiming as many as a dozen lives in a single ritual. The Ravencrofts became increasingly strategic in selecting their victims. At first, they chose individuals who wouldn't draw suspicion: widows, orphans, drifters, those with no one to miss them. But over time, emboldened by total control over their flock, they began selecting from within the congregation's own families. This was no longer merely a ritual. It became an honor. To give a child to the spirit they preached was the highest form of devotion. Carver recalled with deep anguish, parents would compete for the blessing. They would offer their children with pride, pleading to have them chosen. I watched mothers kiss their sons goodbye as though they were going to paradise. Fathers wept with joy when their daughters were named. Within the church's power structure, the brothers remained outwardly distinct, Elder Ezra as the thunderous voice of law and divine command, Deacon Silas, the intellectual, endlessly transcribing the doctrine into volumes of theology, and Prophet Caleb, the living conduit of revelation. But behind the scenes, the balance began to shift. Former Inner Circle members later revealed that Prophet Caleb's influence became absolute. His visions now guided nearly every aspect of church life. By 1840, he alone selected the candidates for elevation. He chose the methods. He dictated every symbolic act, and his mind was unraveling. Recovered journal pages from a hidden compartment in Caleb's chambers revealed a descent into obsession and madness. The texts were riddled with incoherent phrases, ecstatic proclamations, and disturbingly precise anatomical sketches. In one entry from 1842, he wrote, "The Spirit has revealed that the soul does not reside in the heart nor the mind, but is distributed in sacred nodes throughout the body. Each elevation lets me map them more precisely. Each one is a door." Soon, Caleb wrote, "I shall have the complete divine anatomy." By 1845, with membership swelling to nearly 300 souls, the Ravencroft brothers found themselves facing a grimly practical dilemma: what to do with the growing number of bodies resulting from their increasingly frequent elevations. The sacred catacombs, once a place of eerie stillness, were now filling with corpses. And so, in what may be the cult's most grotesque innovation, the brothers found a way to dispose of their victims While turning a profit, they began selling human remains to medical schools. In the mid-19th century, legitimate access to cadavers for anatomical study was scarce. Medical colleges relied heavily on the bodies of executed criminals, but such sources could not meet the exploding demand for dissection and research. This scarcity had birthed a black market populated by so-called resurrection men body snatchers who robbed graves or trafficked the unclaimed dead from almshouses. Deacon Silas, always the intellectual among the brothers, used his academic connections to establish covert partnerships with agents supplying medical institutions in Albany, New York City, and even as far south as Philadelphia. These agents asked few questions and paid handsomely. Church records, painstakingly reconstructed from fragments recovered during later raids, suggest that between 1840 and 1845, at least 67 vessels were donated to the advancement of medical science, a euphemism that thinly veiled the sale of murdered followers' remains. This unholy commerce served several purposes for the Ravencrofts. It allowed for discreet disposal of evidence. It brought in significant income. And most disturbingly, it deepened Deacon Silas's own macabre knowledge. Through feedback from medical students and professors, he learned how to preserve tissue more effectively, how to inflict pain without breaking the skin, and how to slow the body's systems to prolong suffering. These lessons would later be incorporated into more advanced and horrifying rituals. By 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit had metastasized from a fringe sect into something unprecedented in American religious history, a self-sustaining ecosystem of indoctrination, ritualized murder and commerce, all operating under the legal protections of religious freedom. A system so carefully constructed, so delicately disguised, that one federal investigator would later call it a perfect machine for evil. But perfection, even the twisted kind, is fragile. Despite the brothers' meticulous efforts to control appearances, rumors began to spread. Too many had joined the church only to vanish. Too many families received vague letters and then silence. Those few who escaped rarely spoke publicly, but their haunted eyes and permanent anxiety spoke volumes in small towns like Ravenwood. Locals whispered in taverns and churches. How could so many people disappear from a town of this size without a trace? The whispers might have remained just that, if not for a chance discovery. A low-level postal inspector named Martin Blakely, investigating irregularities in church fundraising documents, minor fraud, it seemed noticed inconsistencies in donation records. But what he stumbled into was a crack in the facade. It would be years before the government acted on it, but Blakely's discovery was the first faint glimmer of the reckoning to come. For the time being, though, the Church of the Pure Spirit continued undisturbed its atrocities, wrapped in ritual, hidden behind stained glass, and smiles, and sanctified by a congregation too entranced or too terrified to disobey. Before we continue our descent into one of the darkest corners of America's forgotten religious history, don't forget to subscribe. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, and share this with others who love historical horror. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now let us return to Ravenwood. By the late 1840s, the public face of the Church of the Pure Spirit had reached its zenith. To outsiders, the Ravencroft brothers appeared as visionary religious leaders riding the crest of the Second Great Awakening. The church compound had expanded dramatically. No longer just a lonely stone sanctuary surrounded by forest. It now included dormitories for unmarried members, modest homes for families, workshops for crafts, and trade a library of sacred writings, and even a school for the children of followers. Visitors who managed to secure an invitation, mostly prospective converts or respected community leaders, often left marveling at the apparent order, prosperity, and peacefulness of the settlement. They saw clean gardens, smiling children, well-fed congregants, and music drifting from open windows. They heard sermons about charity purity and the power of spiritual unity. They were welcomed warmly, shown only what the Ravencrofts wanted them to see. And behind that veil, the spiral continued downward. One night in the summer of 1851, a storm raged across Ravenwood. Lightning severed trees, winds howled like judgment. And amidst the chaos, Prophet Caleb vanished from his subterranean cell. For nearly 48 hours, the compound was locked down. Church members were told the prophet had entered a divine trance and was not to be disturbed. But the truth was far more catastrophic. Caleb had broken into the church's record room, a place even most inner circle members were forbidden to enter, and absconded with a bundle of handwritten ledgers, anatomical drawings, and what one witness later called a gospel written in blood. Then, disheveled, half-naked, and speaking in tongues, he wandered nearly 20 miles through forest and farmland before collapsing near a small town called Pine Ridge. He was found the next morning by a group of children playing near a creek. His skin was caked with dirt and streaked with what appeared to be dried blood. Tied to his waist were the stolen documents, some in leather, others bundled with sinew. He was taken to a local doctor who, alarmed by Caleb's condition and the strange contents of his bag, contacted local authorities. Within days, those documents made their way to James Thornhill, the relentless postal inspector who had kept his quiet investigation alive for nearly 4 years. What he received was explosive. The writings contained first-hand accounts of rituals ledger entries, listing victims' anatomical diagrams, marked with phrases like soul junction and node of purity, and most damning records of payments from medical schools cross-referenced with the names of vessels. The final page in one ledger, written in Caleb's increasingly erratic handwriting, read, "We have peeled back the flesh and found light beneath. They do not scream because they suffer. They scream because the soul does not want to leave." With these documents in hand, and the erratic prophet now confined in a government asylum, Thornhill finally had what he needed. By late 1851, a federal task force was assembled under the pretense of investigating financial fraud, but with secret orders to locate and document the underground structures and confirm the truth of Caleb's ravings. In March 1852, after months of preparation and surveillance, U.S. Marshals, accompanied by medical examiners and forensic experts, descended on Ravenwood under cover of night. What they uncovered sent shockwaves across the nation. Beneath the orderly facade of the church compound lay an underground necropolis. There were rows of chambers meticulously carved from stone and reinforced with timbers lined with hooks, chains, and ritual implements. In the Chamber of Saints, over 180 bodies were found in varying states of preservation. Some posed in postures of prayer, others with faces contorted in agony. Many bore signs of extensive torture, broken bones that had healed, burn marks, incisions matched precisely to the 7 trials described in Prophet Caleb's notes. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas were arrested without resistance. In court, they appeared calm, composed, and unrepentant. Their defense was chilling. All was done in service to the Spirit. Death is only the beginning. The trial held in Albany in 1853 became a national sensation. Witnesses from the church testified in secret for fear of retribution. Journalists were barred from the court's most graphic evidence. The medical community recoiled in horror as the full extent of the human trafficking in corpses was revealed. Deacon Silas's correspondence with medical schools ignited new regulations and widespread reforms on the acquisition of cadavers. The Ravencroft brothers were convicted of multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy to traffic human remains. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. The death penalty was considered. But the court feared martyrdom among surviving followers. As for Prophet Caleb, he never stood trial. Declared criminally insane, he lived out his final years in a windowless cell at the Dannemora Asylum in northern New York, where he died in 1857 scribbling unintelligible symbols into the stone walls with his fingernails. After the trial, the Church of the Pure Spirit was dismantled, its compound razed, and the remains of its victims given proper burial in a mass grave now marked only by a small plaque reading, "In memory of the forgotten." Ravenwood itself dissolved within a generation. Its name struck from many local maps. But even now, the legend of the Ravencroft cult lingers a dark stain on the history of America's religious awakening. A reminder that beneath the banners of salvation, evil can thrive, and that the most terrifying rituals are not those hidden in shadow, but those hidden in plain sight. Macabre liturgy. Some had mouths sewn shut, others with eyelids propped open by pins as if to force them to witness their eternal damnation. Several skeletons bore notches on the bones where ritual carvings had been made post-mortem, some accompanied by copper tags etched with names and dates, likely their so-called elevations. Despite the fire, the water, the ravaged tunnels and collapsed chambers, the evidence was irrefutable. The Church of the Pure Spirit, long operating under the guise of religious purity and spiritual renewal, was revealed to be one of the most grotesque and systematic cults in American history. Though many of its secrets had been hastily buried or burned, what remained painted a chilling picture of what had transpired beneath the town of Ravenwood for more than 2 decades. By late June 1851, with public pressure mounting and the Albany press covering the story with breathless horror, federal authorities officially arrested Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft on charges ranging from fraud and corpse trafficking to murder and conspiracy to conceal human remains. In court, the brothers presented a defiant image. Elder Ezra, in particular, claimed that the world was not ready for the truth revealed by the Spirit. They denied any wrongdoing, framing the dead as willing martyrs and the rituals as sacred duties. But no amount of theological posturing could withstand the storm of testimonies that followed. Former members came forward, emboldened by Prophet Caleb's dramatic public collapse, and the partial unearthing of the underground chambers. Their stories, a line of indoctrination disguised as enlightenment suffering, presented as a path to grace and death, offered as the highest form of devotion. A grand jury indictment followed in August 1851. The trial, held in Albany through the winter of 1851-52, became a national spectacle. Newspapers across the country referred to it as the trial of the century. Courtrooms overflowed with the curious and the horrified. Evidence was displayed behind screens, and jurors were excused to separate chambers to hear the most graphic details. The testimony of Thomas Hartford, Martha Simmons, and especially Elizabeth Carver, who had survived 12 years in the cult, broke through even the most hardened disbelief. Medical experts testified that many of the bodies bore signs of prolonged suffering before death, burns in geometric patterns, bone fractures in stages of healing, and water damage consistent with repeated near drownings. The final damning blow came from Dr. William Garrett, who presented evidence that at least 67 cadavers from the church had been sold to medical institutions between 1840 and 1845, none legally sourced. On February 3rd, 1852, the jury returned its verdict. Elder Ezra Ravencroft guilty on all counts. Deacon Silas Ravencroft guilty on all counts. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment at Sing Sing prison. But what of Prophet Caleb? Though never tried, Caleb's legacy proved most haunting. He remained in Dannemora Asylum, scribbling indecipherable notes and screaming through the night until his death in 1857. A nurse's journal from the time noted that his final words were whispered through a bloodied mouth. The spirit has moved on. Another cradle will be found. Legacy and erasure. In the years that followed, Ravenwood was abandoned. The town's name was removed from maps by 1860. The land where the church once stood was purchased by the federal government and designated as restricted. Local legends spoke of strange noises at night, flickering lights beneath the earth, and a persistent smell of burning herbs in the air after rainfall. Today, few records remain outside academic archives and federal vaults. The Ravencroft brothers' crimes have largely faded from public consciousness, obscured by more modern atrocities. But among scholars of American cult history and fringe religious movements, the Church of the Pure Spirit remains a chilling blueprint, a cautionary tale of how easily the promise of salvation can become a mask for horror. As one investigator famously wrote in a footnote to the 1853 report, the greatest evil ever committed in Ravenwood was not what was done in darkness, but what was permitted in daylight by those who saw only what they wished to see. From hidden caches in the Ravenwood compound indicated that the Ravencroft brothers had orchestrated similar cycles of manipulation, ritual abuse, and disappearance in at least 3 prior locations: Norwich, Connecticut, 1817-1821; Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1822-1825; Elmira, New York, 1836-1838. In each of these towns, the brothers had taken on religious titles, often under different names, and founded short-lived congregations centered on purification, suffering, and rebirth. In Norwich, old court records referenced a fire that destroyed a boarding house run by Reverend Elias R. Cross, a name now believed to have been used by Elder Ezra. In Elmira, the disappearance of several orphans from a church-run shelter in 1827 had been dismissed at the time as runaway cases. But Blackwood's team now believed they were early victims of what would become known as elevations. What made Ravenwood exceptional was not only the longevity of their operation spanning over 2 decades, but the refinement of their methods. The use of psycho-spiritual conditioning, controlled exposure to rituals for new members, the institutionalized disposal of bodies through the medical market, and a religious hierarchy that demanded suffering in exchange for spiritual elevation. These tactics allowed the Ravencrofts to operate in plain sight, beneath a veil of religious freedom and community respectability. The trial of the Ravencroft brothers. When the trial opened on November 4th, 1851 in Albany, crowds lined the streets and telegraph reports were sent nationwide. The press dubbed it the Church of Blood case, and though details were heavily censored in public reporting, the courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, and religious leaders seeking to either condemn or defend the line between religious liberty and criminal extremism. The prosecution, led by New York Attorney General Thomas R. Jenkins, presented a mountain of evidence. The ledger from Deacon Silas's quarters, over 50 former members' testimonies, including children, medical analysis of the preserved remains found in the Chamber of Saints, financial records tracing the sale of bodies to multiple medical colleges, Caleb's confession and hand-drawn maps of the chamber system. The defense, thin and increasingly desperate, argued mental illness, doctrinal misunderstanding, and tried to blame Caleb alone. But Silas's own handwriting and Ezra's confirmed signatures in records removed all doubt of their complicity. Their guilt was not just assumed, it was recorded in detail by their own hands. On January 19th, 1852, the jury took less than 4 hours to return its verdict. Elder Ezra Ravencroft, guilty of 83 counts of first-degree murder. Deacon Silas Ravencroft, guilty of 76 counts of first-degree murder and trafficking of human remains. The judge, in a moment of rare emotional transparency, told the court, "In my decades on this bench, never have I encountered a darkness so deliberate, so premeditated, and so masked by the language of holiness." Both brothers were sentenced to hang. Their execution took place on March 3rd, 1852, behind the Albany Penitentiary, attended by federal officials, but closed to the public. The aftermath. Though justice was served, the scars left by the Church of the Pure Spirit did not heal quickly. Ravenwood was formally dissolved by New York State Charter in 1853. Its land was confiscated and later converted into federal territory, eventually becoming a restricted archaeological and forensic site off limits to the public to this day. Investigators and scholars who continued to examine the Ravencroft legacy discovered that even more ledgers and ritual documents had been removed or destroyed before the fire, suggesting the full number of victims may never be known. Today, estimates vary, but the most commonly cited figure is that between 300 and 400 individuals were elevated over the church's 22-year reign. Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, confined to the asylum at Utica, died in 1857, reportedly after gouging out his own eyes during a fit. Nurses claimed his final act was to draw something on the wall with his own blood, a spiral with 13 eyes. the same pattern carved into the sanctuary floor during the first ascension. Legacy. The Ravencroft affair had a lasting impact on American religious law, catalyzing debates about the limits of religious freedom, the need for oversight of spiritual institutions, and the moral hazards of charismatic authority. The story also lives on in folklore and fiction, often retold as a ghost story, urban legend, or cautionary tale. Ghost tours in upstate New York occasionally reference the spiral church. The phrase Ravenwood Eyes has entered local slang to describe someone lost in dangerous belief. A 1986 horror novel, Saints Below, was loosely based on the cult's legend, and to this day, the spiral pattern remains a symbol associated with fringe occult groups online. Was never about salvation. It was about transcendence through truth. This chilling admission marked a turning point in the federal investigation and would later be cited in early criminological studies as one of the clearest examples of religious ideology used as a mask for experimental sadism. The discovery that the Church of the Pure Spirit was at its core a decades-long human research program carried out under the guise of divine revelation stunned even the most seasoned investigators. It also raised uncomfortable questions. How many institutions had knowingly or unknowingly collaborated? How much of early American medical advancement rested upon the bones of the Ravencroft's victims? A doctrine of dissection. Deacon Silas's notebooks revealed not just obsession, but methodical purpose. He and his brothers had sought to test what he called the threshold hypothesis, that human spiritual transcendence could be induced through carefully calibrated physical suffering, and that each bodily system contained specific nodes through which divine energy could be accessed and measured. Entries were clinical, cold, and grotesquely specific. Subject 143. Pressure applied to thoracic plexus induces vocal harmonics mimicking glossolalia. Repeatable. Trial 88 complete. Removal of eyelids without anesthesia led to sustained vision hallucination reports. EEG patterns, crude external probes consistent with elevated neural activity. The heart is resilient. The soul more so. Silas had effectively turned the basement of a church into a cross between a laboratory and a medieval torture chamber. And his writings indicated that he saw no contradiction between science and sacrament. In fact, his theology demanded they be unified. Institutional complicity investigators also turned their attention to the medical schools and anatomists named in the Ravencroft's correspondence. While many institutions denied wrongdoing, the paper trail was damning. A Boston letter from 1845 praised the uniform cleanliness and preparation of the vessels provided by the church. A professor at a Baltimore anatomy school privately admitted under questioning that he had grown suspicious of the body's origins, but looked the other way. No criminal charges were ever filed against the colleges, but 4 prominent doctors quietly resigned, and a Senate subcommittee was convened in 1852 to investigate the use of unethically obtained human remains in medical education. The resulting report led to landmark legislation in 1854, restricting how anatomical specimens could be sourced and requiring documentation of all donations. While not directly naming the Church of the Pure Spirit, the law became colloquially known as the Ravencroft Regulation. Final reckonings. On October 11th, 1852, nearly a year after their arrest, Elder Ezra Ravencroft and Deacon Silas were executed by hanging. The event was not public. Federal authorities feared turning it into a spectacle, but a small group of officials and former victims' families witnessed the execution. According to one observer, Ezra met death with a smirk, muttering something unintelligible as the noose tightened. Silas remained silent until the end, his final words reportedly being, "We were only trying to see the truth." Their brother, Prophet Caleb, died in 1857, as previously noted, in an asylum cell covered in scribbled spirals and muttering of sacred points and the map of light underskin, legacy of horror and knowledge. The ruins of the Church of the Pure Spirit were eventually razed, though the underground catacombs were sealed and studied extensively for decades. Today, the site is managed by the National Historical Forensics Trust and is off-limits to the public, accessible only by researchers under strict protocols. Despite the horror, the Ravencroft affair had profound effects on medical ethics, religious oversight, and the study of cult psychology. The following changes were directly influenced by the case. Reform of cadaver acquisition laws in multiple states. The 1855 Religious Oversight Act in New York, granting state inspectors limited authority to investigate closed religious communities under suspicion of criminal activity. The founding of the American Ethical Medicine Association, AEMA, in 1856, citing the Ravencroft case as a catalyst. In the decades that followed, the story of the Ravencrofts became mythologized. Some fringe occult groups claim to carry on their sacred research. Horror writers cite them as inspiration. But the true story, unearthed through meticulous investigation and survivor testimony, remains a chilling monument to the human capacity for both belief and brutality. Under false business names, and no congregation members were ever permitted to visit. I was told the garden was where the most sensitive elevations occurred, too sacred, too dangerous for common eyes. Parsons' information prompted an immediate search. On October 19, 1851, federal marshals and investigators arrived at the remote farmhouse hidden deep in the Catskill foothills, now overgrown with autumn thistle and cloaked in silence. Inside the weather-worn structure, they found an unassuming parlor and pantry, but a trapdoor beneath a dusty rug revealed a reinforced staircase descending into darkness. The garden final horrors unearthed. What investigators found beneath the farmhouse shocked even the hardened men who had excavated the catacombs under Ravenwood. This was not merely a mirror site, it was a refinement. The underground facility, later dubbed the Garden by investigators, consisted of a symmetrical series of stone rooms, each more specialized than the last. There were preparation chambers, outfitted with iron surgical tables and strange brass instruments, observation rooms with crude two-way mirrors behind which church members could record or witness experiments, a library containing anatomical sketches, surgical manuals, and what appeared to be original medical treatises written by Deacon Silas under a pseudonym. But the final chamber, marked on Silas's ledger simply as the orchard, contained a forest of metal frames, some occupied by human remains, others empty but stained and scarred by repeated use. It was here investigators believed that the longest and most invasive experiments took place. In total, at least 48 bodies were recovered from the garden, many showing signs of vivisection, experimental surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, and even early attempts at organ transplantation. Bones were drilled, nerves tagged and traced, and extremities replaced with crude prosthetic attachments made of leather, wood, and bone, from cult to experimentation network. This discovery reframed the entire investigation. The Ravencroft operation could no longer be dismissed as just a deranged religious cult. It was now understood as a hybrid of theology, pseudoscience, and criminal enterprise. Most chillingly, some documents in the garden's library suggested that Elder Ezra had begun seeking successors, training others in their methods, and preparing what he called the Third Revelation, a plan to expand their doctrine to other communities under new names. Letters recovered from the farmhouse indicated that small groups of initiates had already been sent to St. Louis, Richmond, and even San Francisco, disguised as revival preachers or itinerant healers. The trial and its aftermath. The trial of Ezra and Silas Ravencroft, already underway by early 1852, now incorporated these new discoveries. Public interest exploded. Though many documents and details were sealed from public record newspapers, hinted at ghastly revelations emerging in court. Witnesses broke down on the stand. Jurors reportedly wept. One resigned. Despite attempts by the defense to blame everything on the insane delusions of Prophet Caleb, the overwhelming evidence, including Silas's notebooks, the ledger, the bodies, and now Parsons' testimony, made conviction inevitable. On March the 17th, 1852, both men were found guilty of 173 counts of murder, illegal medical experimentation fraud, and desecration of human remains. They were hanged at dawn 2 weeks later. Their deaths were unceremonious, buried in unmarked graves, denied the rights they had so often perverted. Echoes through time. The legacy of the Church of the Pure Spirit endured in strange ways. Medical textbooks were quietly edited to remove any references to Ravencroft-provided research. The 1853 Anatomical Integrity Act was passed, requiring federal oversight of all cadaver-related transactions in the U.S. Seminaries and religious institutions began introducing safeguards and ethical training to prevent charismatic leaders from exploiting Scripture for abusive ends. In 1879, a series of bizarre disappearances in Missouri led some to believe a splinter group of the church had re-emerged. But the link was never proven. The grounds of the Ravenwood Church were eventually reclaimed by Forrest, and the garden was sealed with concrete in 1911. Yet whispers persist. Hikers in the Catskills still speak of hearing chanting from the woods at night, and Ravenwood locals refer to the area only as the Hollow Place. Final reflection. The Ravencroft case is a reminder of how charisma, belief, and power can be weaponized, and how the line between religious fervor and scientific ambition can dissolve into horror when unchecked. For all its darkness, the story continues to inform how we protect the vulnerable, regulate science, and define faith. Their deaths had meaning, Elder Ezra claimed. But it was not the meaning he believed. Their lives and their brutal ends became a warning carved into history. A plea whispered from beneath stone floors. Beware the shepherd who speaks of flames, highlighting signs of prolonged trauma surgical manipulation, and most damning clear evidence that many of the procedures had been conducted while the victims were still alive. Diagrams from Deacon Silas's own journals were presented in court, showing precise anatomical renderings that matched wounds found on recovered bodies. The prosecution emphasized not only the brutality of the acts committed, but the cold, methodical way they had been documented. Proof that these were not the actions of madmen, but of men acting with intent and purpose. The defendants' strategy and collapse Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas initially attempted to maintain their long-standing defense that Prophet Caleb had acted alone in his madness and that they had merely been unaware or deceived. But the sheer volume of evidence ledgers in their handwriting witness testimony, placing them at multiple elevations, and financial records of body sales shredded this claim. As the trial progressed, the strain on the two brothers began to show. Ezra, once a commanding presence in the pulpit, sat slumped in his chair, whispering incoherently to himself. Silas grew visibly agitated whenever anatomical evidence was introduced, at one point yelling at the court, "You don't understand." They volunteered. They were willing. A moment of chilling silence followed when the prosecution read aloud a letter from a 14-year-old girl, Rebecca T., recovered from the garden facility. Written just days before her death, it read, "They say I will be blessed soon, that I will feel the Spirit inside me. But I am cold all the time, and my arms don't work right anymore. I don't want to be blessed. I just want to go home." Verdict and sentencing. On February 24th, 1852, after only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Guilty on all counts, including 173 murders, conspiracy to defraud, illegal human experimentation, and desecration of remains. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas were sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was to be carried out publicly on March 31st, 1852. Despite appeals from religious figures for mercy on account of delusion or spiritual misguidance, Governor Washington Hunt refused to intervene. "Mercy belongs to God," he said. "Justice belongs to the people." The execution. The executions took place in a field outside Albany, attended by a crowd estimated at 15,000. Public executions were still legal in New York at the time, but the scale of the event shocked even seasoned reporters. The New York Herald described the crowd as a sea of silent faces drawn by a morbid mixture of fury and fascination. Both men went to the gallows without final statements. Elder Ezra looked toward the rising sun and mouthed what witnesses believed were fragments of the elevation liturgy. Silas wept. When the trapdoors opened, the cheers that erupted quickly gave way to uneasy silence. The legacy of the trial in the months and years that followed the Ravencroft case had sweeping repercussions. National regulations on medical cadavers were enacted, requiring documented consent for anatomical donation and federal oversight. Multiple medical institutions faced investigation, and 2 doctors lost their licenses for receiving remains from the Ravencrofts. Religious groups across the country introduced internal oversight boards wary of charismatic leaders operating without accountability. The 1853 Federal Sanctity of Worship Act expanded investigative powers into religious organizations suspected of abuse or exploitation. But not all consequences were official. In Ravenwood, the land that once held the Church of the Pure Spirit became infamous. Locals claimed the ground never grew healthy crops again. The underground chambers were filled in, then fenced off. No one dared build on the property. A stone marker was erected decades later by a group of historians, bearing only a chilling inscription to the memory of the lost. May truth remain louder than silence. Final words from investigator Blackwood, Daniel Blackwood, whose relentless pursuit of justice broke open the case, would later write in his unpublished memoir, what the Ravencroft brothers built was not a church. It was a machine of suffering, polished by faith and cloaked in respectability. But the most terrible truth is this: they thrived not because they were clever, but because so many chose not to look too closely. Elder Ezra's words, delivered in a calm and unwavering tone, reverberated through the silent courtroom like a sermon from some dark pulpit. He did not flinch. He did not apologize. In fact, he glorified the suffering, positioning himself not as a murderer, but as a pioneer, a martyr of knowledge, a conduit of the so-called pure spirit. When pressed further on the horrific experimentation on children, he replied, "Pain opens the soul. In youth, the veil between flesh and spirit is thinner. The data we gathered, their experiences, were immaculate." This statement sent waves of revulsion through the public gallery. One juror reportedly wept openly. Even hardened reporters who had covered battlefield atrocities and urban crime later wrote that Ezra's testimony was the most disturbing experience of their careers. The New York Evening Post described it as the coldest sermon from the warmest depths of hell. Final arguments and verdict. After Ezra's testimony, the defense rested without further witnesses. The prosecution, sensing victory, chose to give a short, direct closing argument. Freedom of religion does not mean freedom to murder. These men built a theology around pain and called it salvation. We call it what it is: premeditated, systematic evil. On March 6th, 1852, the jury returned its verdict after only 42 minutes of deliberation, guilty on all charges. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft were sentenced once again to death by hanging, and the date was set for April 17th, 1852. Epilogue. The aftermath. The executions were carried out with heavy security. This time there was no crowd, no spectacle. The state denied all media access, fearing the brothers would use the gallows as a final stage. They were hanged at dawn in a private courtyard. Witnesses reported that Ezra died smiling. Prophet Caleb remained confined at the Utica Asylum for the rest of his life, where he died in 1859, reportedly convinced that the spirits of the ascended visited him nightly to continue dictating revelations. The Church of the Pure Spirit was formally dissolved, but whispers of elevation ceremonies and small breakaway groups persisted for decades, some claim even into the 20th century. Several medical colleges quietly destroyed records, and while no official charges were brought against the institutions that received remains or research, a series of resignations and retirements followed. Investigator Blackwood's final reflection. Daniel Blackwood would go on to become the first head of a federal investigative bureau, the precursor to the U.S. Marshals Special Investigations Division. He never fully recovered from the case. In his final journal entry, dated Christmas Eve 1853, he wrote, "I have seen what happens when charisma and intellect combine with cruelty." The Ravencrofts did not believe they were evil. They believed they were chosen. That is what makes them so dangerous. And it is what compels us to remember. Murders in Boston and Cincinnati, each targeting former associates of the Ravencrofts who had testified or aided in the investigation, sent a fresh wave of fear through medical and legal circles. All three victims were found arranged in ritualistic poses, mirroring those from the Chamber of Saints. Each bore a handwritten note in the same style, and ink always signed, "In purification we endure." Authorities now feared what had once seemed impossible. A surviving inner circle continuing the brothers' work or enacting vengeance in their name. The Disciples in the Shadows reports began surfacing across the northeastern U.S. of gatherings in rural barns or abandoned churches where masked speakers preached doctrines eerily similar to the Church of the Pure Spirit. Local sheriffs described finding animal sacrifices, primitive surgical equipment, and symbols carved into wood that matched recovered artifacts from Ravenwood. While most of these turned out to be hoaxes or hysteria, at least 4 incidents between 1852 and 1855 resulted in confirmed deaths, each echoing the Ravencroft doctrine: the body as vessel pain, as purification, and death as ascension. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood, still haunted by the original case, penned a warning in a memorandum dated September 8, 1853. "We believed we had severed the head of the beast, but perhaps it was never a beast. Perhaps it was a contagion, and we have merely scattered the spores." Elder Ezra Phantom, or Prophet. By the mid-1850s, Ezra sightings became legend. He was allegedly seen preaching at a river revival in Nashville, his face bandaged, walking alone through Vermont forests, muttering about vessels, traveling under the name Dr. Everard Wren aboard a ship bound for Lisbon in 1856. None of these were confirmed, but all bore a chilling similarity. The man spoke of transcendence through agony, often with disturbingly precise anatomical knowledge. In 1862, a Union soldier during the Civil War reported discovering a makeshift chapel in the Appalachian wilderness while chasing deserters. Inside, they found sketches of human anatomy, stained altar stones, and a journal signed ER. The final page read, "To bring light into the marrow of men, one must learn to crack the bone." Legacy and silence. By the end of the 19th century, the tale of the Church of the Pure Spirit had largely faded into urban legend, kept alive only in whispered tales among medical students, crime writers, and local historians. But references to the Ravenwood doctrine would occasionally appear in obscure theological tracts and fringe scientific journals up through the 1920s. To this day, neither Elder Ezra nor Deacon Silas Ravencroft has been conclusively proven dead. Their names remain absent from confirmed burial registries, and the ledger from the hidden garden site, once locked away in a federal archive, disappeared during a fire in 1938. and in time they will bring about the great illumination. Thus ended the journal, and at least in the official record, the Ravencroft saga. While the donations sparked renewed academic interest in the case at the turn of the century, federal authorities quietly removed the materials from Harvard's archives within weeks, citing national security concerns. Rumors circulated that the journals contained detailed methodologies for certain elevation rituals and experimental procedures, which, if replicated, could endanger public safety. To this day, the iron box and its contents are believed to reside in a restricted section of the National Archives, accessible only to a small circle of government researchers and historians. Requests for public access have been routinely denied. Legacy of Darkness. Reflections at the dawn of a new century. By 1900, the name Ravencroft had faded from newspaper headlines, but it lingered in whispered conversations among theologians, criminologists, and medical ethicists. The case had ignited critical reforms in medical ethics, with stringent regulation of cadaver acquisition and research practices. Religious oversight spurring the establishment of watchdog organizations focused on identifying exploitative sects, criminal profiling with early attempts to categorize cultic behavior and predict recidivism. Yet perhaps the most enduring consequence was cultural. The Church of the Pure Spirit became an American myth, retold in horror novels, penny dreadfuls, and eventually silent films. Ezra Ravencroft was reimagined as a Faustian figure, part scientist, part sorcerer, his elevations morphing into demonic rites in the popular imagination. Postscript: the 20th century echoes. In the decades that followed, in 1927, a secret symposium on ethics in human inquiry was held at Johns Hopkins. Unpublished proceedings reference Case R as a cautionary example. During World War II, an OSS report warned of possible parallels between Nazi medical atrocities and a previously suppressed domestic case from the 19th century, strongly implying Ravencroft. In 1973, a serial killer apprehended in Maine claimed to be a vessel in the tradition of the pure spirit. In his possession, a copy of Elder Ezra's final sermon, typewritten and annotated. Today, the Assembly, the survivor-founded organization, still exists, operating as a non-profit, advocating for cult awareness and ethical science. On the anniversary of the Ravenwood raid each June, they host a quiet memorial for the known and unknown victims. Final reflection. The Ravencroft brothers were not simply murderers. They were architects of a chilling ideology, a belief that pain, suffering, and death could be sanctified when wrapped in the twin veils of faith and science. Their crimes forced a nation to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of moral boundaries and how easily those boundaries can be crossed when belief demands obedience and knowledge pursues power without conscience. In the end, Elder Ezra vanished, but his greatest creation, the idea that salvation lies beyond pain and that truth is worth any price, did not. That idea has outlived its author, hiding in the dark corners of history, waiting for someone else to believe, finding new methods for the great work of transcendence. The suffering was necessary. The knowledge remains. The spirit continues. Whether this represented Elder Ezra's genuine final testament or an elaborate hoax has never been definitively established. If authentic, it would indicate that he had survived to the age of 115, an unlikely, though not impossible, longevity. More significant than the question of authorship, however, was the fact that the journals contained detailed experimental protocols and observations that appeared to have influenced certain legitimate medical research in the early 20th century, suggesting that elements of the brothers' work had indeed infiltrated mainstream science despite their horrific methods. Harvard officials, upon recognizing the nature of the materials, immediately sealed them from public access. In 1902, after consultation with federal authorities, the collection was transferred to a secured government archive where it remained classified until 1972, when limited access was granted to scholars researching the history of medical ethics. The site of the original Church of the Pure Spirit in Ravenwood remained vacant until 1923, when the state of New York designated it a restricted area, fencing the property and posting warnings against trespassing. Local legends claimed the ground was cursed with stories of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and feelings of overwhelming dread, reported by those who ventured too close to the perimeter. In 1967, a team from the State University of New York conducted the first archaeological survey of the site, using then modern techniques to examine areas that had been inaccessible during the original investigation. Their discoveries included additional human remains in previously unexcavated portions of the tunnel system, bringing the estimated victim count to over 400, significantly higher than the 276 documented in the official record. Most disturbing was the discovery of a sealed chamber containing remarkably well-preserved documents that appeared to outline plans for expansion beyond Ravenwood. These materials suggested that the Church of the Pure Spirit had been intended as merely the first node in a network of similar operations throughout the United States and potentially abroad, a vision that Elder Ezra may have continued pursuing after his escape. Today, more than 160 years after the Ravencrofts' reign of terror was exposed, their legacy persists in multiple domains. In religious studies, they represent an extreme example of how charismatic leadership, incremental normalization of deviant behavior, and the human desire for transcendent meaning can combine to enable atrocity. In medical ethics, their case continues to be cited as a foundational example of the necessity for moral boundaries in scientific inquiry. In criminal psychology, they stand as early examples of organized, systematic killers who operated under the protection of respected social institutions. For the communities and families touched by their crimes, however, the Ravencrofts represent something more immediate and personal, a wound in the fabric of American history that has never fully healed. Descendants of victims and survivors still gather annually in a small ceremony at a memorial established in Albany in 1902, bearing the simple inscription, "For those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten." The questions that haunted investigator Blackwood in 1852 continue to resonate. How did the brothers develop their unique fusion of religious control and pseudoscientific experimentation? Who else knew of or facilitated their activities? And perhaps most disturbingly, how much of their influence persists unrecognized in institutions and ideas that continue to shape American society? The true horror of the Ravencroft case lies not merely in the brothers' grotesque acts, but in the recognition that their story represents not an aberration, but a dark possibility inherent in the human capacity for both reverence and cruelty. Their legacy stands as a warning about the dangers when charisma, authority, and ideology combined to override our most fundamental moral constraints. In the dense forests of upstate New York, the land where the Church of the Pure Spirit once stood remains empty, the earth still scarred by foundations that no amount of time seems able to completely erase. Local residents say that even now, on particularly still nights, the area is marked by an unnatural silence, as though something in that soil continues to absorb sound, light, and warmth, hungry for the human suffering that once fed it so abundantly. This mystery shows us how thin the veneer of civilization can be when authority figures twist faith and science to serve their darkest impulses. What do you think of the story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next